Okay, again, if I get dropped or if you guys get dropped on your end and you can't get back in more than 5 minutes or so, just check for the presentation and discussion points on the Canvas site. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. All right, first, what we've been doing with these sessions is going over key information that we would have covered this week, either in the recorded sessions, and I want to go ahead and summarize some of those key items and key points. Also, we'll have an opportunity for you guys to ask some live questions regarding any of the material. I'll remind you, of course, what types of things you're supposed to be doing, reading the textbook chapters, going over the homeworks, using the notes, etc., and watching the videos. But again, we're also going to be talking about things a little bit later as we start to wrap things up for this particular course. Now, using the chat feature, you may have already done it, but using the chat feature at this time, please type in present so I note that you are here. And so when I add the column for some bonus points, you guys can obtain some of those. Okay, so I'll try to remind you when other people show up on the session for them to do that. Let's go ahead and get started into the content then. So this week, what we've done in this particular chapter, chapter 17, we examined cognitive psychology. That's what we've been focused on. And looking at the overview of this particular topic, we'll be covering such things as intervening variables, which was introduced last week. We'll talk also about mental representation, some of the early influences in cognitive psychology, Chomsky and others, and the idea of the cognitive revolution. And then we'll spend some time looking at the concept of artificial intelligence and how it is that people have thought about this thing called artificial intelligence, what exactly it is, and what it actually means to some of the other conversations we've had about philosophy of mind and things of that nature. And then we'll introduce, as we wrap up today's session, cognitive science, where we are currently. So let's go ahead and get going. So what about Tolman's intervening variables? Well, we talked about this briefly last time. The intervening variables are these hypothetical internal states that are used to explain relationships between observed variables such as independent and dependent variables. And so the idea that he proposed that there is something very important going on that we can't see, something that's going on internally to us. And some of the examples of these intervening variables, these things that get between the independent and dependent variables, are going to be things like learning, memory, motivation. Again, remember at this time too, we see a lot of behaviorism going on. And of course, the hardcore behaviorists, they shun these types of ideas because these are things that we cannot see, we cannot observe. So what we see with Tolman's intervening variables is that cognitive aspects, now cognitive aspects are part of the work of psychology. So that was the significance of what he did by coming up and theorizing about these intervening variables. Now we have this particular cognitive aspect getting some sort of attention. So the intervening variable, an experiment by Tolman and Hanzik in 1930, they looked at latent learning in rats, specifically the group that received the reward every time they reached the goal. And of course, that sounds very behavioristic because it is. They do a behavior, they operate on the environment, and then they receive a consequence for it, which then will have some sort of impact on their future behaviors. So one of the independent variables was the number of practice trials the rats received. They got one trial per day, so each rat got an increasing number of trials. The dependent variable was the number of wrong turns or errors that the rats made on a trial. So the following graph shows the relationship between the independent variable, the trials, and the dependent variable, the errors. So we can see what goes on with these particular trials. So what we see with this graph, the average errors goes up from 10, okay, and we see the number of trials goes all the way out to 17. What this graph indicates is that as they do more and more trials, they're committing fewer and fewer errors. So the practice trials serve as the independent variable. The errors are the dependent variable. So theoretically, what Tolman and Hanzik are suggesting here is that there's an internal state of learning, quote, learning, that intervene between the independent variable and the dependent variable. That is the intervening variable, learning. Now, obviously, learning is something that we don't see directly inside the organism, but we do see the outcomes of it. And so what we see here with Tolman and Hanzik, they're just pointing out the fact that this is some very important stuff, that this learning, what's going on inside the organism, should not be ignored. It needs to be focused on. So it was this state that caused the errors to decrease, the state of the learning, not the practice trials. The practice trials may have gotten you there, but it was the learning that caused the errors to decrease, to go down. That was the important aspect of this. Now, again, one of the other things too that I just want to focus on real briefly here is that we've talked about latent learning. And again, this idea of latent learning, which I think we touched on before, is the notion that we may learn something and not really be cognizant of the fact that we've learned it, not until there was an opportunity for us to demonstrate that learning. So latent learning, sort of like learning on the down low, learning that is somewhat subtle, that we don't realize it until there's an occasion for us to need it, or we're motivated to do something about the thing that we've learned. So the intervening variable in operational definitions. So one of the key things as well is that these intervening variables are studied by means of operational definitions, a term I'm sure you've seen a couple of times in this course and many others. And these operational definitions are the descriptions of the procedures that are assumed to have some link to an internal state. So the operational definition is going to be key in helping us to uncover and to realize the impact of the intervening variable. So we see something that we've talked about at the very beginning of this course coming back to us again, how these things are sort of being tied together. The next idea we want to talk about is mental representation. And this is an internal state of an organism that reflects or mirrors actual or possible states of affairs in the external world. So what we're seeing here, so we've talked about this intervening variable, which is happening inside the organism, inside our mind, allegedly here. And now we're talking about something else in a very similar way, mental representation. Is that somehow when we look and observe things out in the world, we represent those things inside us as in an internal state in some form. Tolman referred to this idea as a cognitive map, that we have a map of something, okay? It's not something that is physical, it's something that is internal to the organism. So we have this sensory input and we bring it into our mind space, so to speak, and it is represented there in some sort of abstract form. So for example, we can look at local features such as colors or line orientations, okay? And we represent them. In fact, we have special clusters of cells in our brain that sometimes are designed to pick up on these things quite readily. We can extend things in our mind, change them, rotate them, embellish them, transform them. And the idea is that we do all these things in our mind. And so there's stuff going on inside of us that we see here is important to our ability to interact with the world around us. We see such things as the figure ground, okay? We see such things as these blocks that we can rotate with our mind. If you ever played some computer game, we do that to make them fit. I don't know if anyone's ever played the game Tetris, but that's the same type of idea. We have to rotate these things in our mind to see where does this group fit somewhere else. We also see the following. Posner did a letter matching task. Are these letters from the same category of vowels or consonants, or are they different? And what we do is we transform these into abstract information representations in our mind. So what mental representation is doing really, it allows for more sophisticated behavior than what the behaviorists would have us do with simple stimulus response. Okay, that's what they all said, stimulus response. But what we see here with mental representation, it indicates that we do something internally that really does matter. And so that's what we're doing. We're seeing here these researchers building a case, so to speak, for cognition, for thinking, and the importance of it in psychology and studying psychology. We have the Stroop task, where we have name the color in which the word is printed. That is, don't read the word, just say the color. And we know when we do these types of tasks, it can be very difficult. What this represents is some sort of internal influence, okay, or impact on us, because what's happening is it causes an issue internally to us, because we see the red that we're wanting to say, if you see red, say red, but then we're trying to read the word. So there's an internal interference. So something is going on inside of us. And of course, behaviorism could not really clearly delineate and describe what those things are using their approaches. And of course, with the blocks, we rotate those things in our mind. We can embellish things in our mind. So we can use our mental space almost as a canvas to change things. And psychology did not want to ignore that type of stuff. They wanted to start to focus on those types of things. This is something that the behaviorists would not allow us to do. So now let's look at some of the early influences. So throughout psychology's history, human cognitive abilities have been studied philosophically and later experimentally. We have contributors like Fechner and Ebbinghaus that we've talked about before, and James even, that helped us to look at these things, these cognitive things that have some important impact and influence on our life. One of the early ones was Jean Piaget, which you guys are familiar with. His work demonstrated that the child's interactions with their environment become more and more complex and adaptive as its cognitive structure becomes more articulated through maturation and experience. So as we grow and develop through maturation, our cognitive structures become more intense. And as we experience things as well, they become more intense as well. As Piaget would phrase it, we develop our schemas of the world and how things operate and how things are connected. So his work in cognitive development between the 30s and 40s contributed to the revived interest in cognitive issues in the 50s. Some other early influences with cybernetics is the study of the structure and function of information processing systems. We have Shannon and Weaver began what is known as information theory, notes the various transformations of information, that we have to do stuff to information. One of the things that you're probably familiar with when it comes to information processing models is how it is that we view memory, that we have stimuli in the environment and then we must encode it. We do something to it so that we can then store it for long-term memory. And then we need to retrieve it. So the idea here is that this opened up the possibilities for us to understand human nature at a whole different level. We also saw the work of Noam Chomsky. He argues that the human brain is genetically programmed to generate language, all right? Each child is born with brain structures that make it relatively easy to learn the rules of language. One of the debates was that language is a very complicated thing. And we cannot simply see how it is possible for children to learn languages relatively easily, by just stimulus response and behavioristic concepts. So he proposed that there is something that's sort of native to us, something that's sort of pre-programmed in a way that helps us do that. And that's what he referred to as the language acquisition device. It exists because environmental stimulation alone cannot account for the speed and proficiency in which children acquire language. So what we see here again is just these individuals building the cases for something that goes well beyond behavioristic concepts, things that must be going on inside the organism. And because of that, they did not want to ignore this anymore. They wanted to start to open up the black box, so to speak, and to examine what actually is going on inside of us, because that gave us a more complete picture of what is happening within humans. So the beginnings and people of contemporary cognitive psychology, we start off with George Miller, which you guys probably remember as well from Explorations in Short-Term Memory. He argued at a symposium on information theory that this marked the beginning of modern cognitive psychology. He continued to move the interest in cognitive psychology along with several contributors, Miller, Brunner, and they founded the cognitive studies through which Piaget's ideas were popularized in the United States. So this memory researcher, and that's how we know him mostly, this memory researcher sort of expounded on those ideas and said, this is something that we cannot ignore. We need to start looking at cognition and those things related to what we now call cognitive psychology. We also see with Carl Lashley and Hebb continue to discuss physiology and behavioral phenomena and cognitive processes. Hebb in his APA address basically said the scientific rigor of behavioral researchers to study cognitive processes, sort of like marching orders during his presidential address, to say we need to start looking at cognitive processes more. He noted the work of Festinger and Miller and all these individuals, and we'll talk about Festinger in a minute here. But he also encouraged the use of computer models to help us study cognitive processes. And that's what we have seen quite a bit, is that the idea of the computer has been used as an analogy greatly in this particular area to help us understand how it is that we function. So Leon Festinger, a social psychologist guy as well, noted that the ideas that one may have might sometimes be compatible with or incompatible with one another. And when we have incompatible ideas or things which our behaviors and our attitudes are not aligned with each other, it can cause this thing called cognitive dissonance. Okay, this sort of anxiety, this tension that results, that you have to now do something to lower this tension that comes about because of this dissonance. And just to give you, to round out this idea about cognitive dissonance, normally when we do have cognitive dissonance, and let's say it's an attitude that is in conflict with a behavior, what do we change? Do we change our behavior or do we change our attitude? Well, the research would tend to suggest we change our attitude about it so that our attitude becomes in line with our behavior. Because remember, if we have a behavior and we keep doing that behavior, that tends to suggest that there's something that's reinforcing that behavior. All right, so we have something keeping that behavior strong, okay? And therefore, the easiest thing for us to do as humans then would be to change our attitude. Now, the key thing, and why we bring this up now, is that he came up with this idea of cognitive dissonance and how it may change our beliefs or behavior, but he did so with no reference to behavioristic ideas. So it was not the behavior that was influencing change here. It was something internal, this dissonance that caused us to do something, to change something. And that was a really big idea at the time. So some of the factors behind what we now see as a cognitive revolution. During the 1950s and 60s, we see this represented a shift away, to some extent, from behaviorism to more mental processes. Now, around the same time too, or a little bit after, later 60s as well, we also saw too, and we talked about this at one point, a move in humanism or humanistic psychology, because the figures of Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, they did not like the power of behaviorism, which was very cold and calculating, meaning that they said that we could control people just by controlling the consequences of behavior, and didn't like the idea of the psychodynamic or Freudian ideas about how the unconscious really controls an individual's life, things that happen way in their past. So why I bring up humanism is because that whole movement also brought back into the limelight the ideas of things which were very cognitive in nature, self-actualization, motivation, and those types of things. So all that stuff was going on at the same time that sort of helped lead us back to studying and examining mental processes. Now, some of the antecedents that led to this cognitive revolution were, first and foremost, technology. Better technology did a great deal of things, many things for us. It allowed us to start to see the types of things that were actually going on in the brain by using certain imaging techniques. So this also led to better research techniques allowed by this technology. And then the advent of computers presented us a new way to understand how the mind worked. We already talked about information processing and looking at computer modeling ideas to explain how our memory works. And then we see at the same time the rejection of behaviorists' obsession with learning on simple tasks. Okay, so they saw all these things coming together almost like a storm in a way to sort of help lead us to examining more thoroughly the idea of mental processes. So again, the study of problem solving, language comprehension, and thinking, all this led us to cognition. And we see one of the early ones of cognitive revolution was Albert Bandura, who came up with the social cognitive theory, began its early development, and is still a popular theory in use today. How it is that our social influences and our cognitions help to sort of influence each other and dictate our behavior. So that gives us a really good foundation. We've talked about Tolman and his intervening variable, mental representation, and how that led to, along with other things, led to the establishment of a sort of cognitive revolution, so that now that we can revisit the ideas of thinking, cognition, mental processes is now something that can be studied again. So that brings us to the idea of artificial intelligence. Now, what is AI? A special branch of computer science that investigates the extent to which mental powers of human beings can be captured by means of machines. AI is the science of making machines do the sort of things that are done by human minds. So human minds are amazing, and they can do a lot. They're very creative. We have these great insights. And so the notion was, can we program a machine to have that same type of thing? The assumption here is going to be that the AI is that both humans and some machines are nothing but information processors. And it requires us to view the brain like a computer. And I want to revisit one concept that we've talked about already before to a great extent, and that's functionalism. Functionalism, mental states are to be characterized in terms of their causal relationships to sensory inputs, behavioral outputs, and other mental states. That is, in terms of their functional role. And there was an idea that we might have touched on briefly at one point, that if we could duplicate what the brain looks like, and but using other substances like computer chips or circuitry? Can we get the same functionality out of it? Can we build a synthetic brain or artificial brain that has the same functionality that a human brain does? So that's part of what we're seeing happening here. The notion is, now that we have some understanding and greater understanding of the brain, can we somehow, in the mind, can we somehow duplicate that in another way? So this takes us to artificial intelligence and Alan Turing and the Turing test. So he raised the question about and developed a test of whether or not machines think. Other researchers have suggested the concepts of weak artificial intelligence versus strong artificial intelligence. Proponents of weak AI claim that at best, a computer can only simulate human mental attributes. Proponents of strong AI claim that a computer, when properly programmed, really is a mind capable of understanding and having mental states, being able to maybe think independently, to be curious, to maybe even have emotions or to dream, to be creative. So the question then becomes, how do you know when you have a strong AI? First, let's flash back to Descartes. After we finish this slide, I'll take a brief pause to see if there are any questions. So Descartes, again, we go all the way back to Descartes, and we talked about him initially when we started our discussion on the philosophy of mind. And remember that Descartes was very much in the idea that everything is very mechanistic. Okay, the universe is a mechanism, and we are all mechanisms to greater or lesser degrees of complexity. All right, so remembering that, if there were machines which bore a resemblance to our bodies and imitated our actions as closely as possible for all practical purposes, we should still have two very certain means of recognizing that they were not real men. Excuse the sexist terms there, not real men. The first is that they could never use words or put together signs as we do in order to declare our thoughts to others. Secondly, even though some machines might do some things as well as we do them, or perhaps even better, they would inevitably fail in others, which would reveal that they are acting not from understanding, but only from the disposition of their organs. So there are machines, and they're only doing what their machine parts or mechanical parts are allowing them to do. Hence, it is for all practical purposes impossible for a machine to act in all the contingencies of life in the way in which our reason makes us act. And that's one of the things that he discussed a long, long time ago in his discourse on method. So what we've talked about here is a lot of things. I want to ask you guys, how many people out there own something like Alexa? Okay, one of those devices in your home, and you ask questions, okay, and they try, okay. Again, so people have these things, and you do know that they do listen. Most likely they're probably listening even when they say they're not listening, but they're listening. That's probably in the fine print of your agreements with them, probably. But the idea is what they are attempting to do is speak to you in a way that makes you feel comfortable, that makes you feel like you're talking to a friend. Now, many would say what that really is basically a weak AI trying to simulate humanity. Okay, and we know too, you sometimes get phone calls, as I do all the time, from telemarketers, and I answer the phone, they sound like a young lady or a young man, and they begin speaking, and you don't realize that it's probably a recorded message or some sort of machine, okay, that's making robocalls to you, and you may say something, and they may respond in a programmed manner. But what they are attempting to do is to truly act as human as possible. and they're getting better at it. But usually, if you're talking to Alexa, and you ask her a question, sometimes, and it's not that difficult these days to trip her up that she cannot answer a question or can't respond in an appropriate way. But the notion is they're getting better and better at these things. And so the notion is that maybe one day they'll be able to simulate it in such a way that you can have a ongoing conversation, so to speak, with Alexa or Siri or devices like her. And of course, we see all these movies all the time. There's a few on HBO now, I believe, and Netflix about these artificial intelligences or strong artificial intelligences becoming Westworld, becoming so powerful and so controlling that they now no longer see a need even for us. Okay, so I want to revisit this idea of Descartes and what Descartes said hundreds of years ago, because now we go back and we can see this. These are some empirical and conceptual questions that Alan Turing thought of. He developed this thing that he at one point referred to as the imitation game / the Turing test. Can a machine meet the Cartesian challenge, what Descartes just alluded to in the previous slide? Can they use language in a way that humans do rather than merely uttering sounds, exhibit the complexity and flexibility of behavior in a wide range of areas as humans do? For example, when you're talking to Alexa and you're having some sort of conversation and then you change text altogether and change the subject, will she be able to realize that you changed the subject? Will she be able to maintain the communication, okay, and the conversation? All right. What, if anything, of philosophic interest would it show if a machine could pass the Turing test? Is passing the test necessary for intelligence? Is passing the test sufficient? Now, what is this test? What is this imitation game? Well, what he basically said is this: the Turing test, originally called the imitation game, is a test of the machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behaviors equivalent to or indistinguishable from that of a human. Turing proposed that a human evaluator or interrogator would judge natural language conversations between a human and a machine, designed to generate human-like responses. So if you look at the graph on this particular slide, you see A represented by a machine, B represented by a woman or a man. There's a wall there. And then C is an interrogator, a human interrogator, and he cannot see A or B. He doesn't know if there's a man or a woman behind them necessarily. They're asking questions and then they're responding to them, maybe in text, but you need to be able to identify in this conversation. The interrogator needs to say, I believe A is a machine. Okay, and if that's indeed the case, then they did not pass the Turing test. The machine was not able to fool the human into thinking that it was too a human being. Because remember, as Descartes proposed, he says that it would be impossible for a machine to be able to fool us in that way. But Turing said if at any point a machine could fool us at that, it would pass the Turing test. But again, if they do that, what does that mean? That's still up to a debate to a degree. What does it mean? Now, this all comes down to the idea of being able to tell humans and machines apart. Now, there are things out there which test to be able to determine whether or not you are a machine or a human. You guys are very, very familiar with it. If you do any sort of online banking, okay, or do anything financial online, you'll probably run into these things. Okay, so what can people do that computers can't do? Whatever you can do, I can do better type of thing. So telling humans and computers apart is an important thing on the internet, because people design programs to try to take advantage of websites, to make continual requests of them so the website will crash, for example. And so there's this thing called CAPTCHA. And CAPTCHA is a program that protects websites against what they call bots by generating and grading tests that humans can pass, but current computer programs cannot. For example, humans can read the distorted text as the one shown below, but current computer programs can't. So that's why you have to, for me, by the way, I never can do it. All right, when they have the words all stretched out with lines and different capitalizations and all this type of stuff, I have to do it several times before I can get one I can actually do. You know, but the idea here is that what CAPTCHA is attempting to do, and this is what it stands for. CAPTCHA stands for Completely Automated Public Turing Tests to tell computers and humans apart. Because it's an important thing to make sure for a particular website that the person that they're talking to is truly a person and not a machine making this request. Because if it was a machine or a bot, they could make thousands of requests, and then others can log on and make other thousands of requests and slow that website down. So it's important for us to realize that this is what's happening. We see these things that's important to be able to distinguish between human and machine. Now, some people believe that we will not have artificial intelligence or strong AI. Now, again, if we do have strong AI, if anybody's ever seen the series of movies, the Terminator movies, I believe it is, where you have Skynet. Anybody familiar with Skynet? Have you recall that? I don't know if you guys still watch that movie. But Skynet was this system that was sort of like an AI, and the government gave the AI control over nuclear weapons, which is never, ever a good idea. But the notion is that it then decided that the world would be a better place without humans. So that would be an example of a very strong, malevolent AI taking charge of things. Now, John Searle, basically what it comes down to, Searle says that he believes that we'll never have a strong AI. So we never really have to worry about Skynet. All right. So Searle distinguishes between syntax, the manipulation of symbols according to specified rules, and semantics, assignment of meaning to symbols. So he stated that computer programs have syntax, not semantics. That human thought has intentionality, that we intend, we are motivated to do things, but computers do not have that. So he proposed, and I think there's a video segment on this that you guys probably already watched, that was the Chinese room argument. Okay, and the Chinese room argument is the notion that he said that if you had a computer that you could program with all the symbols of Chinese characters and all this type of stuff, and said that if you get this this character in Chinese script, this is what you respond. And he says you could do that, and you could have this person pretending, this system pretending to have a conversation in Chinese with somebody in another room. Okay, but he would say all it really is basically just going through the motions. That is all syntax. All you're doing is getting something. You receive a certain Chinese script, and you say, if you receive this one, respond with these Chinese scripts. And what he's basically saying, that all that really is syntax. You're doing and going through the motions. You're only manipulating symbols based on rules that have been described or programmed into you, but you really don't understand it. And that's what he was saying is the key thing, is understanding. So it's one of the best known and widely credited counters to claims of artificial intelligence. So what it comes down to, that Searle basically says, is this: machines don't think, they simulate thinking. No matter how good the simulation may be, it's only a simulation. So from Searle's argument, okay, he's basically saying we don't have to worry about Skynet. We don't have to worry about the Terminator, okay, because we'll never be able to get it to that point, a strong AI. But this is not to say that we can have a very, let's say not a weak AI, but a moderately mid-level, middling powerful AI do something stupid and cause a bunch of issues if we gave them control of nuclear armaments. So the idea here is that there is a debate whether or not we'll be able to get to this singularity, they sometimes refer to it, where we have this system become self-aware and be able to have mental processes, like being able to dream, for example. So a few more questions on this idea of artificial intelligence. Are humans machines? Now, we've seen this talked about in a variety of ways throughout this course so far. Even Descartes said it to some extent, that we are to greater or lesser degrees machines. The only thing that he really was able to distinguish between us and animals was that we had a mind, okay, or a soul from his perspective, and that differentiated us from the brutes out there. So are humans machines? Some would say that we are just a different type of machine, a biological machine. This question reintroduces important questions into modern times, such as what is the nature of human nature? What is the nature of human beings? This type of question posed in relation to machines brings into play the issues of, again, mind-body questions and the lawfulness of human behavior and free will. So as part of one of the bonus activities that you guys have access to now, I believe, there is a short video clip from a TV show that I've seen several times that will ask you some questions about artificial intelligence. It takes it even to a larger level, not just an artificial intelligence, but someone who is a synthetic person, a person who, by all judges that we can, has feelings and emotions and can have life and death. And what do we do with those people? So the question is, and that's what this link represents here, there are several ethical questions that always come up when we talk about artificial intelligence. If we're ever able to develop artificial intelligence, that is, develop a mind that truly does think, and we put that mind into a body that is increasingly more human-like, what are some of the issues that would pop up if we did that? I mean, we'd probably even have to have psychologists for AIs, okay, to specialize in AI psychology, because they have questions about their existence and all those types of things. It may sound kind of funny and stupid now, but who knows what's going to happen with your great-great-great-grandchildren, for example. Will they have to deal with this type of stuff? So if you are able to design intelligent machines, okay, that have strong AI, it would cause a major repercussion to many things in our society. For example, if you had someone who would never get sick, showed up, didn't talk back, didn't have a lot of baggage compared to human beings, would you not hire them? So that would probably mean that unemployment for humans would probably go up. And if you have a bunch of AIs working at your factory or doing work, okay, where does the wealth created by those AIs go to? All right. How do we interact with them? Do we use these AIs ethically? How do we treat AIs? So I'm going to pause there and ask you guys, if we did have an artificial intelligence, would you be worried? You can send a chat, or if you have something to say, you can speak up and say it. But do you have a concern that we'll be able to develop artificial intelligence in the future?
I do believe that artificial intelligence has already been developed. And
Okay.
I say that because I used to work for the VA hospital, and they had a robot that delivered medication to each floor. This robot, if you stood in the robot's way, it would either try to get around you, or it would actually wait until you moved out the way. Once the robot delivered that medicine to that room or that nurse's station, the robot goes back to the elevator and knew exactly what floor it was going to, and no one was actually controlling the elevator for the robot, and the robot wasn't remote controlled. It was programmed to be able to do these things.
So it's making certain decisions independently based on its programming. And obviously
Correct.
the thing about it is this: at one point, who was doing the job of that robot?
Well, to it was humans.
Right,
It
it
was
would have been a
humans.
person. So basically, the idea is that when we get more and more people or more machines, and we see this already. I mean, automation has changed the landscape of the entire world, particularly here. Uh, that we have machines that can do things much more efficiently than humans can do it, and they don't call in sick, okay, and we don't have to worry about them as much. So these things do become something of concern to society as a whole. In fact, we see it already. We don't have as many jobs in this country because we are our standard of living is too high and cost of work or labor is too high. Therefore, it makes sense to have certain types of jobs simply done by machines or done overseas where the cost of labor is much cheaper. That's just the reality of it. But when you develop systems where you have robots who can do more and more stuff, increasingly more and more stuff, and more complicated, then it really changes dynamics altogether. You think we're going through a bunch of social stuff now and upheavals today in this era. Imagine, if you would, when you have synthetic people who are taking people's jobs, who are, I mean, you could have a whole factory of synthetic people and no real human being to be seen. Now, probably nowhere close in our lifetimes, but again, in your great, great, great grandchildren's lifetimes, they may see something like that where they have to do those questions. But the question also too, first, let me ask you this: has anybody ever seen a movie about? I think there's a couple movies out there, Real Humans or Humans, okay, where it's about they've developed synthetic technology where you have artificial intelligence and you can build them in very human seeming bodies, okay, that seem to be made of flesh. Now, if that ever happens, there are going to be a lot of potential abuses. Okay, and what you saw there, it talks about human nature. We saw people having matches where you get robots to fight, and of course, I'll just go ahead and say it. There were the sex bots. There were all sorts of things that people do based on what human nature is like. And now, if you have people who are increasingly more human-like, the idea is going to be very powerful that people will probably go to their baser needs to do this type of stuff. And there's a few scenes that come to mind in some of these shows. The remake of Real Humans was Humans, as a British show, where you have this lady who, this robot, synth, I think they're called, who is working in a bordello, a prostitution house, and she gains full awareness and she doesn't like what's going on, so she leaves and kills a few people in the process. But the idea is that we do this type of stuff. If we ever develop strong AI, it will cause a ripple to have a great deal of other conversations dealing with ethics of how we treat them. And again, as you'll see in the activity that you guys have, bonus activity, should they have any rights? Do these people who may be synthetically derived in some way, should they have any rights equivalent to the rights of people like us? All right, and so the idea, these are types of things that have been called into question. Someone wrote about Bicentennial Man, one of my favorite movies with Robin Williams, where you see these questions pop up all the time. And again, it's something that if we ever do get to artificial intelligence, this is some of the things that we'll have to deal with as well. All right, any other comments and questions before we move on? Okay, so basically then, let's move on to the next slide here. This leads us to cognitive science, all right? And cognitive science, cognitive science is the following. It uses the computer as a model for human information processing. It follows the rationalist tradition. It has a strong nativistic component, meaning that certain skills or abilities are native or hardwired into us. Okay. It also looks at faculty psychology. The idea that the mind is separated into faculties or sections, and that each of these faculties are assigned to certain mental tasks. Like there are certain mental tasks that we have as part of our mind that allows us to process that sound or that vision and all this type of stuff. So information processing marks a return to this idea of faculty psychology. And we'll see more of these ideas in the upcoming chapter as well, that will focus on expanding on these ideas of faculty psychology and modular psychology. So the other thing that we see as well, when we look at cognitive science, is this return to the mind-body problem that we've talked about time and time again. Uh, Radical behaviorists deny the existence of a mind. Okay, remember that's the hardcore. They thought we had no notion of trying to figure out anything about the mind. We could do everything with behavior. And cognitive psychology does assume the existence of this mind thing. And this came about by the early works of McDougall, when we talked about that in behaviorism, and Tolman, all the way to mental representation, to what we've talked about today. And in each case, bodily events and cognitive events are assumed. And therefore, with this, the relationship between the two must be explained. So we need to now figure out what it is and how these two things are related to each other. And that introduces us to this idea of cognitive science. And again, in cognitive science, in the 1970s, information processing psychologists combined with efforts of philosophers, anthropologists, linguists, neuroscientists, a very interdisciplinary approach is what cognitive science is, trying to understand all these things that we've talked about so far about how it is that we think and how it is ultimately do we have a mind. Remember, from the very beginning of the philosopher of mind conversation, and we talked about this, what is consciousness and how does it come about? And that is basically what this whole idea about artificial intelligence is really doing as well. They're saying, is there going to be a way in the future for us to program something in such a way that consciousness, awareness of self and your environment and all the things that bring about, such as mental processes of thinking, dreaming, even feeling, comes about? That's what they're focused on and what they're looking at. All right, so let's go ahead and start wrapping things up here. Couple of things. We have the last chapter for next week, modularity neuroscience. So we'll have one more group of recorded lectures as well as one more check-in. And in that last check-in, which will be really, really brief, I'm sure, we'll talk about a variety of things as we wrap things up. I want to announce a couple of things real quickly here. I have something called the Psychology Senior Assessment. It's a bonus activity. When I say bonus activity, what this means is it can't count against you, but it can help you out. That has been posted and it's available. It's called Psychology Senior Assessment. You can only access it from going to the modules and then selecting it from that table. Okay, it's going to be near the bottom. I think I have a due date of November 15th. I think you should go ahead and take it as soon as you can. You can't, excuse me, you really can't study for it necessarily. And let me give you an idea of what it's about. It's going to be about an hour long. I think they're like 50 items. And what the items are, however, is going to be about psychology. And it's going to be about psychology from a whole bunch of different areas. So we use this in our department to try to assess how well we are doing and instructing and teaching you guys. It's have some of the concepts from other classes in psychology sort of settled into your mind, so to speak, so that you can respond to these items properly. So don't worry about your score. If you do well, I'll even give you more of a bonus. But the idea is that taking this will give us some idea of where we are with our program here. And please try to do your best. I will remind you again that even though some of the links may still be up, essays 5 and 6 are no longer required. I want to point to another bonus activity of artificial intelligence Intelligence and Synthetic Life Forum. I think that's the one that's the Battlestar Galactica one. There's a link with that, and I see that some of you have already done that, and that's for extra credit as well for you guys. And there'll probably be one more, along with, of course, we'll have the final exam that you're required to take, but there will be probably one more other bonus thing, and I'll explain that a little bit later. What that is going to be sort of like a more of a comprehensive items from a different test bank, so to speak. And again, it'll be optional for you, but it'll be allowed to replace a lower test grade or to give you some bonus points and some other areas that if you need them. All right, so that's all I want to cover with you guys for today. Are there any questions or comments? You can either send it through chat or speak up. Okay, so I guess everyone's a little bit tired from staying up probably a little bit later the last few days. Okay, I'll leave it at that. So yes, the final exam will be our final module test, which is going to be module 5. So it will cover only chapters 16, 17, and 18. And I hope all of you will do the psychology senior assessment bonus activity for me and for my department. Then also the bonus activity for the discussion forum. And I'll just give you a little bit more insight into the other item. It'll be an optional, it'll be sort of like an optional comprehensive exam where it will be a few items from each of the key chapters that we talked about. And I'll be working on that to make it a little bit easier and simpler in a way. And you take that, and I can use the score if it's better than any other previous exam that you've done to replace a lower test score. And that's what I normally do for that. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later in the description and everything. All right, are there any more questions? Okay, if that's no more questions, I think that's it from the chat. All right, you guys take care. Stay safe. Don't wind up on CNN for anything, because usually if you do, it's bad. I'll talk to you guys and have a nice weekend.